All right, let's go back to the covenants. And certainly in Exodus, as I've said, we hear the echoes of the Abrahamic covenant explicitly, and also the introduction to this next covenant, as I said, probably best called the covenant with Israel, because that's with whom the covenant is made, but it's made at Sinai through Moses, and so called the Sinaitic or Mosaic covenant as well. But the key passage, and of course we're back here kind of unpacking theme number 5. The key passage as far as this new covenant is concerned, that we have not yet seen, is in chapter 19. Chapter 19, verses 3 through 6. Israel comes to Sinai. This is where they're going to be for the next 11 and a half months. Verse 3, Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. Okay, that's a reminder of the judgment, the strong hand, the arm of God, the power of God, seen in the 10 plagues and the dividing of the sea and the return of the sea upon the Egyptian army. This is a reminder of what Yahweh did to the Egyptians. And I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. It's going to return to this idea at the beginning of the 10 words, which I believe is a prologue to the 10 words in chapter 20, verse 2. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You were under bondage to Pharaoh. You were his slaves. You had to obey his will. The commandments he gave you were that which was to direct your life. Now that has been broken. And notice the personalization. You were Pharaoh's, you are now mine. I brought you to myself. And so there is a sense in which, through the Exodus, a personal relationship has been established between Yahweh and Israel. It was based upon Yahweh's redemption, upon Yahweh's deliverance, upon Yahweh's strong hand, his work. What had Israel done? Israel had just responded in faith. By the way, you see that at the end of Exodus chapter 4, verse 31. So the people believed. And when they heard that Yahweh was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshipped. And what did what did Israel do? What work did they have to accomplish, to get out of Egypt? Well, they did have to do one thing. They did have to slay a lamb and put the blood on the doorposts, so that when the death angel passed over Egypt, he would pass over their houses. So they had to respond in faith to what the Lord had commanded. And once again, after the Egyptian army had been drowned, Exodus chapter 14, verse 31, when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord. They believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. Now, at the very beginning, chapter 4, the very end of the Exodus experience, there's an emphasis of the fact that Israel believed. I don't think we have to necessarily, follow Sailhammer completely on the purpose of the Torah. But he certainly has got a very important point that Moses does emphasize that Israel has come to Sinai, come into a relationship with Yahweh on the basis of what? Faith. They believed Yahweh. They believed what Yahweh had communicated to them through Moses. And acting in faith, they basically sat back and watched Yahweh do the work. Does that sound familiar? It was Yahweh's action that brought salvation. Yahweh's action that brought redemption. Yahweh's action that accomplished his will. And in fact, it goes back even to the Abrahamic covenant. Do you realize that the reason Israel is at Sinai is because of their association with Yahweh through the Abrahamic covenants? They're the seed of Abraham. The seed to whom Yahweh had promised, I'm going to give your seed the land. They're at Sinai because of the fact that they had been chosen as Abraham's descendants to be there, and God had now broken their allegiance, their bondage, their servitude, slavery under Pharaoh, and now they were his. They were his servants. They were his slaves. They now were to get their directives from him. And so basically they were at this point, 19:4, on the basis of faith. But then Yahweh goes on in verses 5 and 6. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice. By the way, who was a man whose relationship with Yahweh was established by faith? Who was one who obeyed Yahweh? Abraham. Genesis 15:6. Genesis 26:5. 4 and 5. The one who believed and was accounted to him for righteousness is the one who obeyed. So, yeah, they should reflect upon Genesis as they hear this. All right, like Abraham, faith leads to obedience. Same thing here. Faith is to lead to obedience. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. Now, they are at Sinai because of Yahweh's covenant faithfulness. At Sinai, where they have an intimate knowledge of Yahweh. Chapter 6, they experience what Yahweh means. They experience the eternal self-existent one fulfilling a provision of a promise that he has made and bound himself to by covenant oath. He is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. They are there because of Yahweh's covenant loyalty. Now, what is Yahweh calling for on the part of Israel? Their covenant loyalty. Obey my voice and keep my covenants. And if you are loyal to the covenant that I'm going to make with you, Here will be the result. Then you shall be one, my special treasure among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. You're going to be my unique treasure. Now, I have other treasure. The whole earth is mine. Going back to the Abrahamic Covenant, ultimately there's going to be some from every family of the earth that are going to be blessed. I've got treasure in people other than you. But if you now, because you have this relationship with me, because of your faith toward me and my covenant loyalty, if that faith will now manifest itself in obedience in your covenant loyalty, then you will be, out of all of the peoples of the earth, you will be my special treasure. Now, what Yahweh is saying here is, you're going to have a special place, a special role. You will have privileges that no other peoples have. You are special in that way. You're a special treasure. And he spells out in two ways where they will be special. One, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests. Good title for a book, huh? A kingdom made up of priests. Now, think about that. A kingdom implied is ruled by a king. Who's going to be the king? Who's going to exercise authority? Who's going to be the ultimate king over Israel? Is going to be Yahweh himself. And one whom Yahweh will choose, designate. So there's going to be an authority. You're going to be a kingdom. You're going to be a people. You're going to be in a land. Again, Genesis chapter 10. Common ancestry, common language, common land. Makes a biblical nation. And you're going to be a nation ruled by a king with a priestly character. You're going to be a kingdom, a people ruled by a king that is going to have a priestly role. What is a priest? A priest is one who represents others before God. And so, where are the priests for all the rest of the people is going to come from? This is part of being the special treasure. There's only one nation that God has chosen to represent the nations before Yahweh, and that is Israel. You can't come to Yahweh by any other way than through this mediatorial nation. And they're mediators, they're priestly mediators. Now that's how Israel was to represent the nations before God, but a special treasure also who will be a holy, set-apart nation. This is speaking about how they're going to represent God before the nations. Kingdom of priests looks Godward. Holy nation looks manward. I know we're not there yet, but let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Just to let you know that I'm not misunderstanding. Chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. This is Moses preaching, explaining, and actually in chapter 4 explaining Horeb and the experience that they had there and what that should do as far as their fear of Yahweh and obedience to Yahweh. Verse 1, and now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I am teaching you to perform, in order that you may live and go in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. All right, don't be disobedient like you were at Baal Peor. But verse 4, but you held fast, the Lord your God, are alive today, every one of you. See, I've taught you statutes and judgments, just as the Lord my God commanded me that you should do thus in the land where you're entering to possess it. Why? So keep and do them. For that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who will hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today? Your obedience is to be a testimony to the nations. You hear the statutes. You do them. And the nations are going to look and say, wow, what a wise and righteous people. Whoa. Whew. Is there any people like them so near to God that God hears them? And God has given them these directives, and they know how to live. And of course, their tongues will be whetted. They will desire, they will have an appetite to know Israel's God. And they're going to see the revelation of Yahweh in the Torah, and of course, as that is lived out. As Moses said, be obedient. See to the fact that you obey. A holy nation, set apart nation. This is a testimony they were to have to the nations. Now, he doesn't get into that in Deuteronomy chapter 4, but if the nations are drawn to Yahweh through the testimony they see of Yahweh at work in Israel, and trace that back to the commandments, the statutes, the ordinances which Yahweh has given, and they too want to call upon that God. How are they going to do so? Through Israel. Because Israel is also not only a holy nation, but a kingdom of priests. Oh, for all that in the back of your mind when we get to, the latter prophets of the nation seeking out an Israelite. Teach us the way of Yahweh. Let us come and worship him with you, which is one day going to become reality. So here is the covenant made with Israel, and God, before it's conveyed, gives the very purpose of that covenant. And of course, what you read in chapters 20 to 24 is the actual making of the Mosaic covenant, or the covenant with Israel, number 1. The essential commandments given in the hearing of all the people, chapter 20. Oh, we don't want to hear him personally, Moses. You go up, find out what he has to say, come back and tell us. Chapter 21 to 23, that's exactly what Moses does. And brings the statutes and the ordinances back. The ordinances which he set before them, which is an outworking of those 10 words. And then in chapter 24, you have the actual making of the covenant. Once again, we have the shedding of blood, and Yahweh sprinkling blood upon the people. and also upon the words which the Lord had spoken, the 10 words. And then verse 8, Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you, in accordance with all these words." Now, like the Abrahamic covenant, there's going to be more to come, that God is going to continue to reveal things to Moses that are to be put into effect, so that the fullness of what God wants for Israel and from Israel, which really all comes down to covenant loyalty, will be revealed for Israel to respond. And so this obviously becomes the focal point of the Torah. Everything has been leading up to this. Now, do you realize that Israel cannot understand what happens at Sinai without understanding everything we've read in Genesis and Exodus up to this point? I mean, just to start in Exodus chapter 19, let me tell you about the covenant God made at Sinai. And remember, the audience is the second generation. Let me tell you what the fathers heard and what God required and why. I mean, without knowing everything that led up to it, of God's design for mankind's sin, for the making of the Noahic Covenant, for the making of the Abrahamic Covenant, and how God in covenant loyalty fulfilled aspects of the Abrahamic Covenant in the salvation of Israel to bring the seed of Abraham, the physical seed of Abraham, to himself as his people, to have a living relationship with him. Not for their own blessing, but ultimately for the blessing of the nations. God doesn't demand their covenant loyalty just so they can be blessed, though that is going to be a result. We'll see that in Deuteronomy. Things may go well with you as you enter the land. Be obedient. That certainly is part of the results, the consequence, that things will go well with you, but more importantly, that you will be who Yahweh has called you to be for the benefit, for the blessing of the nations. And so, if I could tie this together at this point, just a little chart. And I know you haven't seen this before, but as they say, a chart is worth 1,000 words. But where are we as far as what God has revealed to this point? Well, we have the Noahic Covenants, going back to Genesis 8:20 to 9:17. The Noahic Covenants that, as we've seen, reiterates the creation mandate that God gave to mankind, and now takes that mandate and the promises and commandments made there and institutes them within a covenant relationship, the Noahic Covenant. And we have seen that God ultimately is not going to judge mankind, though certain, obviously, of men are going to come under his judgments, but that ultimately what he wants is blessing, a blessing that is seen in the regulation of nature during this age, and that's a reminder to mankind of God's goodness, his providential goodness, which is God's revelation of himself to the nations, to the Gentiles, and requirements of mankind in Genesis 9:1-7, that they are to obey those ordinances so that violence would never again cover the whole earth, so that there is a break put upon man's sinfulness, because God ultimately talks about the fact of withholding judgments. i.e., implicit as we've seen, bringing blessing. That God only wants to bless mankind and restore mankind to his proper role and function. But mankind is still sinful, and so that's where we've seen the need for the Abrahamic covenant through an individual, the coming king, national aspects of the nation of Israel that would have an impact worldwide upon all the nations, some from all the families of the earth being blessed through the Abrahamic covenant. Now, what we have with the Mosaic or Israelite covenant is a further delineation of these national aspects of the covenant, that Israel might be Yahweh's special treasure to the blessing of the nations. Now, what is not in Exodus chapter 19? But certainly when we see kingdom of priests implicit, kingdom of priests implies a king. Now, the king at this point is Yahweh. But we've already seen in Genesis chapter 49 that ultimately King Yahweh is going to establish a human king in the line of Judah over Israel. That the one who is going to defeat God's enemies and bring in God's blessing is this singular king that is going to come in the future. And we already know this king is going to be in the line of Judah, who is part of the tribes that make up the nation, so that this individual himself is also going to be an Israelite. This is another way in which Israel is Yahweh's special treasure. Uniquely among all the nations, from you is going to come the king. The king is going to be an Israelite. By the way, put that in the back of your mind, and when we get to Deuteronomy chapter 17, that talks about the king, the promise of the king, and Israel was to choose a king from among your brothers. I mean, one of the first requirements of a king is he's got to be an Israelite. Now, if you know all of Torah, you better say that the Israelite also better be in the tribe of Judah. And when you get to the former prophets, he's got to be in the family of David. But that's to come later. At this point, see again this implication of the fact that, okay, here's part of being, God's special treasure. You get privileges that some other people don't. And one of those privileges, you get to be the nation from which the Messiah comes, the king. I corrected people at the first break, and I got to keep correcting myself. Messiah is never used for this king in the Torah. Messiah will not be used as a title for this king until we get to that great theologian Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Understood Torah and understood what God was doing, and she's the first one who's going to correlate the king with Messiah. And of course, then that's going to become the term by which we can refer to him, from that point on. So I've got to watch myself too, that I like the term Messiah because I live the side of the cross as well. But really in the Torah, this individual is just the king. The king from Judah. But the king who's going to come out of Israel, because that Numbers 24 again emphasizing Israel being the nation from which this king is going to come. So this is all part of a special treasure. Now, why the special treasure? Because, and this is where this line comes, they're the special treasure because they're the seed of Abraham. They're the kingdom of priests, holy nation. Why does God enter this covenant with them? Because of their Abrahamic association. I mean, any nation could say to an Israelite, why did God choose you? And his answer has to be, didn't choose me, chose Abraham. I got into the blessing just by being from Abraham. Could have been born out of Abraham's seed. You could have been in the line of and Isaac and Jacob. You could have been part of it as well, but you had the wrong mother. Sorry. Now, all this again is implying that this salvation and this calling, Jim, let's use the New Testament terminology, is all of grace. What did Israel do to merit any of this? The answer is absolutely zilch. They got born in the right family. How'd you get salvation? You got born in the right spiritual family. You didn't do anything to earn it, deserve it. And of course, the same thing is emphasized here for Israel in the Old Testament. And so this is the interaction with the covenants. And of course, it shows us how key this covenant was to God's plan and purpose for the nations and for ultimately fulfilling through the Noahic Covenant the creation mandate of Genesis chapter 1. And I know in all that I'm sounding very much like Merrill in his theology that we talked about on the purpose of the Torah. But hopefully as now we're starting to march through it, you're starting to see what that purpose is and why the purpose is important. All right, so those are the covenants, and of course to be continued. By the end of the Torah, we'll see a couple more covenants that come forth as well. Now, by this point, you're starting to see why answering that question about the Noahic and Abrahamic covenants in Genesis is vital for your understanding not only the rest of Torah, but the rest of Scripture. I mean, if you don't get the foundation of these two covenants clearly in your mind as seen in Genesis, there's going to be a whole lot of Scripture. It kind of just goes right over your head as you read all the way to Revelation. I mean, these covenants are the undergirding of the biblical revelation. I mean, not just the two in Genesis, but all six that we see in the Scripture. Very, very important, very key. And even during the break, I remember you asking me about Galatians 3 and 4. How can you understand Galatians 3 and 4 without understanding the covenants of Genesis, the covenants in Torah, etc.? I mean, it's that's where Paul is going. And by the way, he's writing that to Gentile believers. Gentile believers, to understand their salvation and not be led astray by false teachers, need to understand what God has said about the interaction, particularly between the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants, according to Paul in Galatians chapter 3. I mean, you could throw your hands up and say, I'm not an Israelite. Why do I need to know all of this? Well, because there's still false teachers around, and you've got to have this clear, else you won't even understand your own salvation. You will understand your salvation in Jesus Christ better if you understand what God is revealing here in the Torah. In fact, you didn't realize that by taking this class, you're being inculcated, you're being given an antidote to false teaching that's all around us. You won't be consumed by strange fire if you get the Torah down. All right, so I don't know, we'll pass your question at that point. But this is important. Even important for us Gentiles this side of the cross. All right, any other? And so we're going to continue to talk about the covenant, so don't worry. This is not the end. It's only the beginning. All right. No debate about the purpose of Exodus. Any work on Exodus, you're going to see something like this. Yahweh, who's already been revealed in Genesis, the God of creation, the God of the patriarchs, redeemed, delivered, brought out the sons of Israel, that is Abraham's physical seed, from bondage in Egypt and entered into a covenant with the nation of Israel at Sinai. Now remember that little quiz you took, Bible assessment? A lot of you got a theme of Exodus, or the purpose of Exodus, getting out of Egypt. A lot of you missed, and a covenant at Sinai. Getting out of Egypt, that's just the first 14 and a half chapters. Gentlemen, you got another 25 and a half to go. All right, that's the covenant at Sinai. Now, that is very, very clear for a purpose statement. But what about the structure? And the sheet I'm looking for got misplaced. There it is, right here. All right, Genesis all over again. First, interpretive issue. What is the literary structure? All right, we have no problems with, we're looking for two things. We're looking for Exodus and we're looking for Covenant of Sinai. Where does one end and the next begin? Well, can we, and already been brought up in a question, can we see Exodus as with a geographical statement, 1:1 to 12:26. And then a bridge from Egypt to Sinai, 12:37 to 18:27. And then they're at Sinai and receive the Sinaitic revelation. And Dr. MacArthur takes that basic outline approach, and broadly, yeah, that does give you a geographical understanding. What happened in Egypt itself, and what happened as they begin to leave Egypt to go to Sinai, what happened to Sinai. Most, however, of contemporary commentators are not following the traditional geographical approach, but seeing that we are dealing with ideas. Well, what ideas? What ideas are we looking for? Again, deliverance and covenants. And a number of commentators will just divide the book almost in half. First 18 chapters are deliverance, and the last 22 chapters are the covenants. Some break it up into three parts: redemption, morality, and worship. So somehow what begins in chapter 25 is unique. The covenant is made. We saw that at the end of chapter 24. So what's the additional? The additional is preparing Israel for divine worship, coming into the presence of God, to be continued in the book of Leviticus. But again, I'm not sure there's three parts. I think it's better to see two parts. And so my outline is going to reflect this last ideological approach that I have given to you. And that is, we basically have two parts to Exodus: the redemption of the sons of Israel, that is from Egypt, the revelation to redeemed Israel that takes place at Sinai. And I'm going to see the break between 1521 to 1522. You say, why? Good question. I'm going to take what I gave you as a chart, and you've got this in your charts. As we think in terms of literary structure, let's think about these two literary frames related to Exodus. The first is to be reminded that what begins in Exodus 1, actually in the outline of the Torah, is the second major division that goes all the way to Numbers 25:18. Hear the echoes of the beginning at the end. The Exodus narrative begins with a battle between Yahweh and a king. That king is the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. Pharaoh, who brings Israel under bondage because he is afraid of Israel because they are a mighty people. In fact, mightier than the Egyptians. They seem to be more numerous. And that is what Moses has emphasized in verses 1 to 7 of Exodus chapter 1. Particularly verse 7, the sons of Israel were fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, literally grew mightily, strongly, with strength, so that the land was filled with them. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, fill the land. Where have you heard that before? Noahic Covenant, which is an echo of mandate given in Genesis chapter 1, Genesis 1, Genesis 9. And what was the promise given to Abraham? I will multiply your seed as the stars in the heaven, as the dust of the ground, as the sand of the seashore. And so here in the microcosm where Abraham's seed was to multiply and fill the land in the same way that mankind was to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, what we see here is an echo, obviously, of the Noahic Covenant and the Abrahamic Covenant, how these two join together. Now, God's blessing, in accordance with the Abrahamic Covenant of Israel, where they become this numerous people, so numerous in verse 9, they outnumber whom? The Egyptians. Hey, look, we were kind and gracious. 70 of them come, or 70 come and join the 4 that are here. 74 people, and we're so gracious. Let them to live among us. Because of Joseph. But now we got a Pharaoh doesn't know about Joseph. Doesn't bring Joseph into account. And yet we were so good to him, and we, gave him this land in Goshen. And now what we find in just a few generations is they're mightier, they're stronger than we are. So we can either do one or two things. We can either join with what God is doing and say, hey, seems like you're flourishing, we'd like to flourish too. Seems like God is blessing you, is giving you abundance of people. We'd like to be blessed as well. We'd like to join ourselves with your God, or we can disdain you. Are you hearing Abrahamic Covenant here? And what does Pharaoh decide to do? Not join them, but disdain them by fighting them. Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let's deal wisely with them, lest they multiply in the event of war. They join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us apart from the land. So we gotta figure out how to stop this multiplication. They disdain God's blessing. They oppose God. Now go over to Numbers chapter 22. Another king. Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was in great fear because the people, for they were numerous. So he can either join them or he can oppose them. Guess what he's going to do? The wrong thing. He's going to oppose them. Calls Balaam to come and curse. Why, verse 5, behold, the people came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the land. And they are living opposite to me. They came out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the surface of the land. Now, what did they do in Egypt? They were fruitful, multiplied, filled that land. Now they've come to Balak, the plains of Moab, and now they're covering the surface of my land. Now, therefore, come, please curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Heard that before? Perhaps I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that whom you bless is blessed, whom you curse is cursed. By the way, you don't have to worry about the implication there. I want you to curse them that I might be blessed. And Balaam, who you bless gets blessed, and who you curse gets cursed. What is this? Abraham number 2? No, but we'll take that up when we get the numbers. But you hear the echoes? The Exodus is the result of a king opposing the multiplication of Israel. At the very end, we have another king opposing the mighty people that's in his land. Significantly, in Numbers 24, the judgment is, for Egypt came at that time, the judgment upon the Midianites, the Moabites, is only going to come at the end of the days. But they're going to be judged just as certainly as Israel was judged because of their attitude toward Israel. Well, why do I say that things begin in 15:22 to 18:27? Follow along what happens. Okay, chapter 15, they grumble. Chapter 16, God gives them manna and quail. Chapter 17, God gives them water from the rock, and they prevail over their enemies. You begin reading in Numbers chapter 11 after they left Sinai. They begin with grumbling. Grumbling over manna, and God gives them quail. And toward the end of that account, chapter 20, God gives them water from a rock, and in chapter 21, they prevail over their enemies. Here are some echoes. And what's in between? We've already said this is the wilderness. Also in the wilderness, but now, most importantly within that wilderness, is the events that take place at Sinai. And even here, and here's a second chart that I give to you to help the frame. God calls Israel to worship Him, and there's to be no idolatry. Chapter 32, Israel commits idolatry. Chapter 17, Israel commits idolatry. God has entered into covenants that there is to be no idolatry. The golden calf, the covenant has to be renewed. With the goat idols, Israel ultimately is going to bear the curses of the covenant because of their disobedience. Idolatry is tied into the covenants and the covenant stipulations. That is to keep Israel from idolatry by worshiping the Lord at the place that He has called, at the altar with the blood sacrifices that He has given. And so the importance of the tabernacle, the altar, and their obedience, their covenant loyalty. And by the way, their covenant loyalty is first and foremost seen in making Yahweh preeminent and not serving or worshiping any other gods. The predominant sin of Israel throughout the Old Testament is going to be what? A turning away from Yahweh to other gods, seen in Israel's practice of idolatry. When did it begin? At Sinai. Israel leaves Sinai as covenant traitors, not those who are loyal to the covenant that God had made. God graciously allows them to do so. There would be a modicum of obedience as they leave Sinai, but that will very, very quickly fall apart when they hit, once again, the rigors, the trials of the wilderness. But particularly these statements about idolatry play a very, very important role. And so, the resulting outline of Exodus that I've given to you in the sheet, you can look at it there. The two parts, the redemption of the sons of Israel from bondage in Egypt, that is Yahweh's acquisition of the seed of Abraham, beginning with the oppression of the sons of Israel because of their multiplication. God raises up a deliverer, chapter 2 through 4, and in chapter 5 through 15:21 we see the deliverance that is effected through that deliverer by Yahweh for the sons of Israel. Yahweh begins to show Israel's need for direction. In chapter 15, they leave 3 days, verse 24 of chapter 15, the people grumble. He cried out to the Lord, verse 25, and the Lord showed him a tree. Yara showed the root from which we get Torah. Torah is a showing, an instructing, a directing. Interestingly, he showed him a tree, threw it in the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and a regulation. There he tested them. And he said, that is, Yahweh, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, keep all his statutes, I'll put none of these diseases on you which I put upon the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. So it begins by showing that Israel needs statutes, needs judgments, needs commandments, needs instruction from Yahweh. They need to be shown how to live properly. Chapter 18, Jethro's advice, counsel, again shows that Moses is overworked. Again, he needs to set up a system and teach what God says to him so that judgment might take place. And only the hard cases come to Moses, and the people need instruction. The people need commandments. They need ordinances. All preparatory for what takes place in chapter 19 to 31, Yahweh's giving of the covenant at Sinai. The making of the covenant to which Israel was to obey, and the revelation of the tabernacle where they could come into personal fellowship with Yahweh. And yet Exodus ends with Israel's breaking of the covenant, but Yahweh graciously renewing the covenant on the basis of Moses' confession of faith, Moses' confession of sin, and the tabernacle is allowed to be built, and Yahweh's presence in the midst of Israel, from where he will speak on how that presence can be maintained in what we call Leviticus. All right, and that's basically the structure, the flow of the book that we call Exodus. All right, so be sure to read it in light of Torah, but in doing so, I think these are the major purpose of redemption and revelation, and how it ties in as far as the structural breakdown is concerned, and how it ties into the Torah as a whole.